I'm your host, Charles Fain Lehman, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and senior editor of City Journal. For decades, City Journal has led the way in shaping America's thinking about urban life. Our work has time and again helped bring New York and other cities back from the brink. Our quarterly print magazine has published some of our nation's greatest policy innovators and cultural critics. More recently, our website has become a top destination for eye-opening investigative reporting that legacy media outlets are too timid to touch. Whatever the format, City Journal's work is distinguished by its empirical rigor, intellectual honesty, and wit. There are things that just don't come across on the written page. Until you've met some of our favorite contributors and gotten to hear how they think about the world around them, you haven't really experienced City Journal as I know it. Conveniently, those people also happen to be fun and interesting human beings. We love the discussions we have around the office or at the proverbial bar, and we want an excuse to have more of them in a way that makes City Journal's audience part of the conversation. We'll try to make sense of the news of the day, get into some of the bigger debates that are keeping us busy, and reveal more incriminating personal information than you would ever want to know. We hope you enjoy the results. If you do, please subscribe to us and rate us extremely favorably on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and any other platforms you can think of. And tell your family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, priests, rabbi, dog walker, doorman, and anyone else you can think of to listen to us too. We're going to have new episodes for you every Monday and Thursday. Don't forget to subscribe so you know exactly when they drop. But now I should introduce my panelists. Welcome to the panelists. Joining me today are Rafael Mangual, crime guy at the Manhattan Institute, Daniel Di Martino, immigration guy at the Manhattan Institute, and Judge Glock, economics guy at the Manhattan Institute. I want us to jump right in. The big news story of the past week, and I think coming into this week, has been the Trump administration's tariffs. They've sort of pivoted yet again in their ongoing push to do something with tariffs. A couple of weeks ago, for those who have had their heads under a rock, the administration imposed exorbitant tariffs on most trading partners. Last week, they ratcheted them back so that most countries now face a still very high 10% surcharge, while tariffs on the Chinese rapidly escalated to almost 150% on some goods. It seems like we've moved into sort of a second stage of tariffs where it's now the primary focus is on a trade war with China. So on Sunday, yesterday, the Chinese cut off the flow of many critical minerals that seems to be threatening American high-tech manufacturing. The administration has, I think, 90 days to renegotiate the terms of free trade agreements with 70-something countries. So we're still very much on the precipice. Markets are still pretty jumpy. It's a little unclear where they're trying to go. So I guess, I want to ask the big question, and Judge, I want to start with you. What exactly are we doing here? Like, what's going on with tariffs? Because I think everyone's a little confused, including possibly some people in the White House, about what the bigger picture agenda is.
Yeah, well, I definitely couldn't predict it because apparently the markets can't predict it going 4 hours out or 2 hours out. And I'm not that much smarter than the entirety of the New York Stock Exchange. So I'm not going to try too hard there to see where we're going. But I mean, one of the interesting things to me that I've discussed with people about these tariffs is that there just isn't a massive constituency for them. So for these tariffs to be really long lasting at the level that Trump wants them to be, you need a big political backing. And we're not in a place like in the 1980s or early 1990s where people are smashing Japanese cars back then, or I don't know, smashing Chinese made iPhones now. People just aren't doing that. There's not the same like visceral outrage about trade that we've had in the past in America, that we had going back in the 19th century when we were practically an isolated economy in a lot of ways. This was a big political issue. And even into the 1990s, again, this was top of mind for a lot of people. But in the recent polling, this is not a big deal. This is like, if you look at the Pew polls going into the last election and other things, this is far, far down the list if people mention it at all, trade or tariffs. And when they do mention it, they tend to be generally positive about it, not unbelievably open to all sorts of trade if it costs American jobs, not saying, I'll sacrifice jobs for cheaper products if you ask them that directly. But the most recent Gallup poll show 81% see trade as a net beneficial thing or an opportunity for America. So there's some desire to do something about trade in the abstract from a lot of people. But outside of the White House, I would say even in the Republican Congress, there's not the sort of strong desire for these massive tariffs that are being proposed, which means I think over the long term, it's going to be really tough to survive, to keep them alive outside of the China tariffs, which is a whole different can of worms. It's something that was both Trump and Biden had a kind of consensus around. Uh, but at these big 10% across the board tariffs, which look like they're going to stay in place, that's that's going to be a tough thing to ask everybody to swallow, especially when the surveys look or the economic analysis looks like this will cost maybe $1,000+ a family. This is going to be a big deal.
And don't forget the 25% auto tariffs, steel and aluminum on all countries. That's on top of everything else.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. There's these huge number of tariffs and things, and like we do know, even though trade was way down the list of issues in the 2024 election, we do know the one that was the number one issue in the last election, the cost of living. That was like
That's right.
far and away the biggest issue that Americans said, what we care about is high prices. And everyone agrees that tariffs raise prices. And so even if they have these other concerns about trade, clearly Americans aren't in a space where, hey, I'll accept an extra $800 paying for a car to protect American manufacturing. We're not in that headspace right now.
I was watching some of the Sunday shows yesterday, and there was some interesting things being said by spokespeople from the White House, members of Congress, which I thought was a good point, which is that the tariffs are certainly going to raise costs, right? Every economist agrees on that. But the question is how is that going to look when you zoom out and consider all the other economic initiatives that the administration is taking, potential tax cuts, for example, especially when you consider the revenue that the tariffs might bring in, the work being done on inflation, it could be that at least some of that cost for the tariffs is going to be offset by some of these other economic initiatives, which, I'm not saying is a reason to pursue this particular approach, but it does seem like the administration is at least thinking about that.
But by the way, happy Passover and start of
Yes.
Easter week. I've heard that argument, Rafa, about, the deregulation will pay for the tariffs. And it's like, obviously, that's not an argument for the tariffs because you could just have the deregulation
Right.
and be better
Sure.
off. But I also think it's meaningless compared to the size of the tariffs. Because if you just take the 10% plus the 145% on China, that all the auto tariffs on top, the steel and aluminum, it's essentially the largest tax increase since World War II. It's much larger than the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in size, if it were permanent, right?
Well, that's a big question, right? I mean, and this is where you're getting mixed messages from the administration. You almost wish they would just say exactly what it is that they're trying to do, but maybe that would be a tactical error and sort of lose them the advantage here. But I mean, they keep bragging about these 75 countries that are knocking at their door, willing to negotiate trade deals. I mean, maybe that's the whole end game, and if it is, maybe these aren't permanent.
Here, I want to, and I feel a little bit of the compulsion to play devil's advocate because that's my job. But I think there's this sort of you think about the madman theory of Trump foreign policy, which is like often a pretty good model, which is that Trump just sort of claims to be the craziest guy in the room, right? This was his case for John Bolton as national security advisor. He's like, when I bring Bolton into a room, people get really nervous because they think he's nuts, and I like that. But this has always been the Trump strategy. It's been the Trump strategy in domestic politics, and it's been the Trump strategy in foreign policy. And so, as Ralph alludes to, like maybe maybe the lack of information is part of the strategy. Maybe the lack of information is just like they don't know what they're doing. But maybe it's maybe it is part of the strategy. To me, the interesting question is, and this gets to what Judge was saying. There are two components here. There's imposing tariffs on our close allies like Canada, which I don't love. And then there's imposing tariffs on the Chinese, for which there is, in my view, a much stronger strategic case. And that's where a lot of the administration's emphasis has been in the past couple of weeks is unfair trade practices in China, China's geopolitical threat, our dependency on China. So, is there an end game? And I'm curious what you think, Daniel. Is there an end game where this turns into mostly a China-focused policy? And if so, is there a way to make that successful? Like, where do we go from here?
Well, I think that you mentioned the case on China, and I think there's a nuanced thing. But the reasoning for imposing tariffs on China goes by first recognizing that they cost us money, we are poorer if we put tariffs on China. The question is it worth it for us to be poorer for national security reasons? Because China will also be poorer as a consequence, and we will redirect imports to other countries, right? But I hear all the cheating, arguments on trade, not just on China. I hear that Canada now cheats on trade, that Mexico does, that the EU does. And so we just need tariffs on every country, and it's a slippery slope into just not trading. And so I think the reason for the chaos is not necessarily the madman theory for negotiation. I wish it was. I think it is that there's different factions within the White House, just like there's different factions in Congress, and everybody has different ideas. Everybody has different goals. There's not a unified agenda. Peter Navarro, or the nickname that Elon Musk calls him, he wants no trade. Other people do want it as negotiation, right? So because there's that internal debate, that also will undermine the reasoning behind the tariffs, because they won't be permanent. We know it. Because if they are, my theory is that if these tariffs last for the 4 years of the Trump administration, Republicans will lose the 2028 election because of the economic disaster that will follow. And what will be the number one campaign issue? How tariffs destroy our economy. We're going to repeal them as soon as 2029 comes. So why would you build a factory when you just need to last 4 years?
Although it was funny. There's this video that's been making the round. Somebody made a mashup of all the likely Democratic leaders that'll still be around in 2028, spouting the very same lines on tariffs. Elon Musk retweeted it with that laughing face. So I don't know. I mean, they're going to have a hard time, I think, selling that to the American people in 2028 if that's their
Flip-flopping? I thought
entire.
that's normal.
Sure.
But they
Sure.
like
Well-
it. But this gets to the constituencies, right? That historically the Democrats, at least in modern history, have been the more anti-trade party, and that's a big part of the constituency. And look what happened in the 2020 election. Biden didn't go hard against Trump on trade. Obviously, he generally supported, and when he got elected, he kept basically everything in, and then increased tariffs over Trump's level, at least on China. But I mean, I think to get on the China point, the important part there is, if you look at the first term for Trump and then Biden, all of the trade discussions were very general, and we had a lot on steel and aluminum and the weird exception of washing machines, which was just a pure kind of lobbying campaign by Maytag. And then we had basically China tariffs. And if you look at the total funds we collected through the Trump and Biden tariffs, something like 95% were on China. Which is, Daniel said, there is a national security issue there, and there seems to be a cross-party consensus about it. And that's what happened in Trump 1 and Biden, despite all of the very general discussions of other tariffs. And as I've pointed out, there's a kind of a consensus going back to the Cold War that we don't maximize trade with our opponent. During the Cold War, we did not try to maximize trade with the Soviet Union, even though we needed stuff from them or wanted stuff from them. So there's that aspect of it that I think is going to be somewhat stable. But this other 10% stuff on Canada and the other things, that again, who is that negotiating with? This is on the ally that Trump already negotiated a free trade agreement with.
It was a big, beautiful free trade agreement. No, I mean, I think that's right, and I think Daniel's point about factions is an accurate one. Rahan Salam, the Manhattan Institute's president, and I had a piece in The Atlantic last week, which was sort of about the politics of all of this, the thrust of which was the sort of broad electorate, the coalition of voters that installed Trump in the White House. One model of them is that the things that frustrated them about the Biden presidency were the lack of prioritization of their economic interests. That, as we put it somewhat vulgarly, they wanted to be rich. They're the big aspirant middle. And that's half the country. That is a winning constituency. As I think Judge Point alluded to, historically, that's been the Republicans' coalition. And, I think the best strategy for the Republicans to sort of carve off upwardsly mobile minority voters from the Democrats is to basically say, look, we're the pocketbook issue party. It seems like there are representatives of that tendency in the White House. Scott Bessent is the Secretary of the Treasury, is the most obvious person in that role. And I think that there is an opportunity here to say, okay, we're going to sort of refactor this approach. We're going to promote freer trade. We're going to prioritize dealing with the Chinese, and we're going to combine this with the deregulatory agenda. And that will actually, long run, serve the interests of those sort of aspirant middle voters, I think that tendency is in conflict with the sort of other faction in the White House that Daniel alluded to, the Pino Navarros, who are just like, tariffs are good, we need to reindustrialize, we shouldn't be trading with anybody, sort of for purely ideological reasons, or even an aesthetic sense that, like, it's just better when we're not autarkic because it feels more manly, I guess.
Although Navarro was on Meet the Press yesterday and was really touting this whole, opening up negotiations line. So maybe he's been brought in.
But he needs to give his job too.
Yeah. Well, he was. I think the last
this is the
question
trade
that was
advisor, by
posed
the
to
way.
him was, "Have you been sidelined?" And he said, "Well, I'm here, aren't I?"
Hey, this is not a bad answer.
Yeah.
Charles, you said that you think that Besen represents like the faction that is not as much like Navarro, and obviously, I mean, Navarro really, I think this is my personal opinion, of course, but like supports tariffs for really ignorant reasons, like total ignorance. Like he's just flat out wrong on everything. But Besant does support the tariffs too, just for a different reason and not as broad as Navarro does. And he's explained it himself too. And for him, it was about the value of the dollar and it being overvalued. And, in a way, even though initial economic theory will tell you that tariffs will actually help overvalue the dollar more and that will help pay for them, what we saw since the tariffs were imposed was the opposite, was a steep depreciation of the dollar, which further made the tariffs more expensive for consumers and importers, because I feel like we're losing confidence, right? Like this manufacturing of uncertainty that is being happening, which initially was with this weird logic of we're going to lower interest rates by manufacturing our certainty, totally backfired because they manufactured way too much uncertainty.
Yeah, the manufactured uncertainty, we lower the interest rates, never made much sense. Because even if that had worked out, the logic was we're going to manufacture uncertainty, which is going to lower the size of the American economy, and that will lower interest rates. But that's, like I said, that's like cutting the numerator and the denominator at the same time. That's not helping us pay down anything. The interest rates went down in 2008 too, and in the Great Depression. That's not a great, reason to reduce interest rates. We have less money to pay for the bonds and everything else in that case. That didn't work. But yeah, ultimately, everyone agrees our trade deficit is going to be the size of the difference between how much we invest or borrow and how much we save. And we don't save enough to do all our investments and federal deficit spending. And so the money's got to come from outside. And unless we're drastically cutting the federal deficit, we gotta run a trade deficit. There's literally no other way.
By the way, we could still close the federal budget deficit and maintain the current trade deficit if investment just goes up. And that would be even better because that means that there's no crowd out. Like we're just bringing in the new money from the reducing the deficit into private investment. So it's either we reduce the trade deficit or we increase investment. Like we don't know what's going to happen.
I can see Charles getting nervous here. We're on to like deficit, surpluses, current account interest rates, and we're like, whoa.
I'm gonna
Turn
take
your
us
cheek,
to the
Charles.
final question. Let me get very concrete. In a month from today, so middle of May, will we still have the same level of tariffs, and if so, on whom? Daniel, what do you think?
One first. I think we are still going to have these tariffs by the middle of May. Yes.
Okay. And at the current configuration, are they going to go up? Are they going to go down?
I mean, no. Things will change. I mean, and they may change by the day or by the week.
Okay, Judge, where do you think we're going to be in a month?
Yeah. Since I can't predict the next 4 hours, I'm definitely not going to predict a month. But in general, the 10% ones are probably going to be in place a little while. I can't imagine that disappears again. Trump in the campaign said 10 to 20% tariffs on everybody, and he said he would do it on day one. So if anything, we've been delayed having those introduced. Now, I think at some point there's going to be pushback, but at least in the next month, 2 months, he's got some runway to keep those high tariffs on everybody.
Yeah, Ralph?
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I think, you'll see some changes, especially as any trade agreements are negotiated. We'll see what happens, but I think we'll likely see some deals negotiated over that next month, and that's going to change what the levels are.
Yeah, I think they're going to want to walk back from the brink. I'm skeptical that we're going to be in as heightened of a state of conflict, with the possible exception of the Chinese, where we're just going to be like, I think there's some strategic consensus that that's worth the cost, and so there's going to be much more pressure to keep those on. But I think Look, the president wants to make deals. He's a deals guy. He likes to make deals. He wrote a whole book on deals. I'm fairly optimistic that they're going to want to take wins when they can get them. And so if they can kill, 10% on Cambodia or whatever in exchange for the Cambodians buying more American made, I don't know what we make that Cambodia wants, but we can make it. Um, I think that they will take the deals where they can get them. That's the political model. And by the way, the costs associated with tariffs are already apparent to me. They're going to become more apparent. The cost of a chicken sandwich went up 10% for me last week, so I'm unhappy about that. Um,
Wait, it did?
it did. It did. They hiked the costs in anticipation of the tariffs.
Interesting.
Uh, so, I think more voters are going to see that. People are going to get more unhappy. So I think we'll start to see more pressure over the next month. I wanna take us into the other story. We at CJ have been following with great interest the story of Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia sometimes student, who was very involved with the protests slash occasional vandalism slash occasional riots at Columbia last fall. Khalil has been issued. The Trump administration is in the process of attempting to deport Khalil, who is a green card holder with an Algerian passport, who's allegedly a Palestinian from Syria. I have a lot of questions about that, but we aren't going to get into them here. Khalil has become sort of a martyr of the free speech left, who maintains that he's done nothing wrong. On Friday, before we were recording this, an immigration judge finally started the full process of removing him by ruling that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had met the relatively low evidentiary bar to remove him from the country, making him deportable. This is just the first step, probably in a long line of litigation that will involve this case. But I wanna sort of take the temperature. Is this good? Is this bad? Daniel, where are you at on this?
On his case, I think it's good. And what I find interesting is that the legal strategy of his lawyers seem to be headed at challenging the constitutionality of the provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act for First Amendment reasons. And so that case will probably head to the Supreme Court if it does. And so I think it's a cool thing from legal purposes, but I think that it's going to be upheld, especially because Rubio did get some evidence and did describe like the reasons why he determined that. And if you want to talk about other cases later, I'm happy to, which I think it's more difficult. But on his case, I do think it's really obvious. He things that are detrimental to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, Ralph, you're the lawyer here. What do you make of the situation?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I'm pretty close to a First Amendment absolutist. I'm a big fan of free speech, but I don't think that gets much play here. I mean, the people making the free speech argument are saying, that the government is engaging in viewpoint discrimination, but no one, I don't think, with any real understanding of the law in the United States would say that the U.S. would be obligated to admit everyone despite what they said, right? So you can take speech into account when it comes to the decision as to whether or not to let someone into the country, which is, I think, a point worth making. But here, he's being removed for the national security risk that he poses, and that's a determination that was made by Marco Rubio. And the rule cannot be that all speech has to be ignored by the people making that determination. So I think this is just different from, just the sort of pure viewpoint discrimination kind of case that would be relatively easy to win here. This is a national security argument where, yes, his speech and his actions that are protected by the First Amendment played into that analysis, but I don't think that the government has to blind itself to the public statements and public actions of an individual when making a determination about the national security risk that they pose. So, to me, this is a pretty easy case. It's also a very good one. I'd like to see the U.S., be a little more protective of, the greatest privilege in the free world, which is to come here legally and be able to live and work and prosper in this country. And there are plenty of people who want to do that, and also don't want to undermine our national interests. And I think those are the people that should be prioritized for entry.
Yeah, I want to just for a little context for those who haven't followed this in exhaustive detail, the sort of core question is he's being removed under a little used component of immigration law that says the Secretary of State can rule that somebody is a threat to our foreign policy interests and have them removed on that basis. The question is, can he be a threat to our foreign policy interests based exclusively on his involvement in otherwise protected speech? The statute says yes. Maybe the courts are going to say no. Our colleague Tal Fortgang, who I think is going to be on the show on Thursday, knock on wood, and others, our colleague Eli Shapiro, have all argued that this guy's probably deportable for reasons unrelated to his speech. But I think it's interesting that the administration has gone in and said, we want to pick this fight. We want to go full on. This is a little bit like what they did with the removal of alleged gang members under the Alien Enemies Act, where they basically were trying as hard as possible to minimize process and sort of test the legal boundaries. I think the same thing is happening here.
They just want the legal case because they could have, charged him with crimes of like property damage, occupation, like they have done so many things. And they chose to just go with this in the INA, in the Immigration and Nationality Act use, because they want the constitutional challenge, I believe.
Yes, I think that's true across the board with a lot of the administration's legal strategy is to say, like, how much latitude do we really have here? We want an answer from the Supreme Court so we could, like, and this gets to something that Daniel's talked. I don't want to bring Judge in a second, but this gets to something that Daniel has talked about, which is so much of the problem with the immigration system writ large predating Trump is just how hard it is to move people through the process. That, like, part of what they're trying to do is figure out ways to remove people from the country without being bogged down in interminable procedural hurdles. And I think that's what the powers that they're looking for.
I think that's right, but one thing to be clear about here, right? This is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, making an individualized determination as to a specific person. There's an inherent capacity limit, on how much of that can be done, right? So I'm not sure that rationale, of just kind of making the process easier by allowing you to sort of skirt the more onerous, legal proceedings, it really makes a ton of sense here because there's just an inherent limit as to how many individualized determinations that the one Secretary of State can make.
You can get a lot of help.
I have a challenge on that, and it's something that is not being reported as much, and it's the terminations of student visas for minor traffic infractions that are happening. It's estimated that it's been thousands in the last month, and it's because I believe they're using AI to cross-check fingerprint readers across the country, and people who have been fingerprinted, even as victims. There's one case of a woman who actually accused her domestic partner of domestic violence, and he was charged. She was determined to be the victim, but she was fingerprinted. Her visa was canceled, even though she was the victim in the crime. And I think it's not because it's purposeful, but it's because they're trying to make it efficiently. And as a consequence, they are actually upending lives of people unfairly. And so that kind of use of technology that is not as advanced as it should be to do that does concern me.
So I was going to say,
please.
can I play the ignoramus here? But I'm not playing. I legitimately don't know. This is outside my area of expertise. The Khalil thing, in terms of his actions, seems like, yes, this is one of the more deportable dudes out there. And that he's not just talking, he's also occupying spaces. Deportable dudes should also be the title of our podcast.
That's actually the title of this podcast.
Yeah. That's a whole nother conversation. But like, so he's occupying buildings. He's working with the people in Colombia. This is not just the speech. He's also doing some stuff that's actively sabotaging the things he's supposed to be here to encourage, with education, etc. As far as I can understand it. But doesn't matter that he's a green card holder. Like Ralph says, no, you were saying like we can't let people in because what they say, and I'm totally with you there. Some guy spouting Nazi propaganda all day and all night. He shows up otherwise admitting all the he checks all the boxes on the immigration form, so we can say no, we don't want you, this Nazi in our country. This guy's already in there and he's got the green card. Does that matter?
It is different legally because you're not in an airport. When you're in an airport, it's different because you don't have rights because you're technically outside U.S. jurisdiction. But once you are inside the U.S., you do have rights. It is different.
I think
you do have rights, but I think this gets to a deeper point. He was issued the green card in November. He's got, is it a 3-year period or 5-year period, Daniel? I don't know.
2-year period of conditionality.
Yeah.
And then in 3 years, you can naturalize because it was a green card through marriage.
Yeah, so he's married to a U.S. citizen. She's pregnant, so they're going to have a kid soon. I think this is, in some senses, feels morally salient. But part of the argument is, uh, because of his actions, he was here on a student visa. He adjusted to a green card. He should have been found unadjustable. All of his adjustment came after all of the stuff that he
That's
is now
correct.
being accused of doing. So the green card is, in some senses, should not have been issued to him. And this gets to the
I
tipping
agree.
point, which is like the premise. There are certain legal rights which accrue to people who are here on a visa, and those rights become more expansive the sort of more permanent the visa is. And on the other hand, the sort of key premise here is like the executive branch has wide latitude over immigration policy for a reason, which is that people who are deprived of their immigration status are not being deprived of life, liberty, property. They aren't being charged with a criminal offense. And so the standard for removal is lower because the premise is like they're here at the pleasure of the US government. There are procedural rights that obtain in the context of removing them. You want to Daniel's point, you don't want to like accidentally label a victim as an offender and kick her out on that basis. But like it does make sense for Marco Rubio to have relatively wide latitude to say, like, this guy's a problem for our foreign policy. It's time for him to go, because that right, that imperative is not really being checked by a right in the same way that, Marco Rubio could not say this guy's speech is a threat to our foreign policy. He should go to prison as a citizen.
Well, this is why I think that Khalil's lawyers are trying to make this a First Amendment issue, because the First Amendment applies to all persons, right? We've adopted this substantive due process framework, which, if you really want to get into the weeds on that, I would say read Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in McDonald versus City of Chicago. In my opinion, one of my favorite judicial opinions ever written, but he gets into why the distinction between substantive due process and privileges and immunities, is meaningful, and of course, privileges and immunities,
This is the text of the
is
14th
restricted to
Amendment, for those
citizens.
who
This is
don't
the
know.
14th Amendment, right?
Yeah,
Which makes,
this is constitutional law nerd nitty-gritty.
Now, this
that's
is
right.
totally outside of my
That's right.
purview.
It's a
So,
great
so,
opinion.
so, so that is why I think they're trying to make this a First Amendment issue, because it gets around that distinction. But I was talking about this with one of our other colleagues, Jim Copeland, earlier. Yeah, I do think that there's potentially something to the claim that the government doesn't have to meet the same burden here, because there isn't the same kind of harm, right? They're not being subjected to a fine. They're not being subjected to imprisonment. They're not being, charged with a crime, and that, the sort of thing that triggers all these other kinds of and there's still process being served here, right? I mean, this person's still being, going through all the hearing process, and there's judicial oversight, etc. But I do think, that this really comes down to is a question about what the rules should be with respect to speech, insofar as it influences the determination of national security risk. I don't think that they're going to be successful on a legal challenge to say that, the Secretary of State doesn't have the authority to rule somebody a risk to national security enough to, justify revoking a green card. And then I don't think the rule is going to turn out to be that speech cannot possibly be considered at any point during that process when making that determination. I think that would really bog us down.
Well, remember, the Constitution already upheld the Trump travel ban.
Right.
The Supreme
The
Court
Supreme
already
Court,
upheld
yeah,
the
yeah.
Trump travel ban, meaning they can
But first
discriminate
term.
even by religion, people entering here.
Entry, right.
The question in this case is that this is not a person that is entering the United States from abroad, but somebody who was already inside. And I think that's why it gets trickier. But I do think that, I just think that in this case, it's the correct decision from the executive branch, mainly because they could have used many other provisions in the INA to deport him. And I would have preferred that instead of the constitutional case, but that's their choice.
The trying to do. Yeah. All right. I wanna wrap us up. So let me ask. I'll start with Ralph. Is Mahmoud Khalil ultimately going to be deported, or who's
See
going
ya.
to prevail here? You think he's gone?
Adios, amigo. He's gone.
Okay.
Oh,
Judge.
Yeah, probably.
Okay. Daniel.
I think he will, because he will be a priority. If this had been somebody else not in the news, he would have waited it out and he would have survived. But this one will go.
Interesting. Okay, so I think he's not going to go, and I think he's not going to go for the follow because I think that they are going to. There are a number of immigration court appeals that he still has to exhaust, and then there are a bunch of federal court appeals, and I think they're going to push the litigation for the next 3 years. I think they're going to succeed at doing that. At which point, an elected Democratic president will almost certainly decide that this guy gets to stay in the country for some reason because he'll become a hot button political issue. So I think it actually comes down to
And
Do you
what's
think
funny
they
is that
win
if
if
he
they
waits
run
it
on
out,
that though? I don't know. That strikes me as a bit
I
of
think
a
there's a real
campaign problem.
possibility that they run the clock on this one and that they're successful at running the clock on this
Yeah,
one.
I don't
and if
see
he
it. I
does,
think
by
he's
the way,
gone.
he will be eligible for naturalization immediately because the
Right.
time as a green card holder will have passed.
All right. On that note, I wanna wrap us up with an entertaining story. This is the City Journal podcast. You should expect to hear much more from us about big cities and in particular New York cities. And we're touching on the news to get you a little bit of sense of who we are, but we'll be getting into some of the city nitty gritty. But I want to give you guys, our listeners, a taste of that. I saw a great headline over the weekend, and I've shared this with our panelists, but I want to solicit their feedback. There's a headline in the New York Times. I'm going to read you the subheadline, the thing that came underneath the headline, and then I'm going to ask our panelists what the headline was. Give me you know what the answer is, but give me your best guess. The subheadline was New York subways have been the subject of debate, with politicians using them to paint the city as out of control and dangerous to residents and visitors. What could go above that subheadline that calls into questions the legitimacy of this idea that the subways are unsafe? Ralph, what's your best guess here?
Yeah, if assuming ignorance of what the real headline is, the best guess would be, this is something that's coming alongside a story about the first quarter crime statistics, which was a significant decline in crime in the subway system,
So
right?
really, it's unreasonable for
Right.
them to be
So,
concerned about this.
the left has long been trying to sort of play this game that it's not as bad as as people think it is. In 2020 and 21, when crime was going through the roof, it's not as bad as it was in the 90s, right? The subways aren't as bad as they ever were. That's what I think. If you read that subheadline, that's what you imagine that it's attached to.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Daniel, what if you saw that subheadline? What would you expect was above it?
I would have said something like imaginary crime. And the reason is it reminds me of when I lived in Venezuela and the Maduro and Chavez regimes said that inflation was all in our minds and it was all imaginary. What we feel is not real. Crime was also fake. Crime is a perception, they told us. And I feel like this is exactly what's going on here.
Judge, what would you expect to be above that subheadline?
Legitimately don't know, and
Good.
I'm guessing there's an actual bad event because New York Times wouldn't feel the need to do this throat clearing. No, it's a real event, but it's just used by bad people to do bad
Right.
things.
That's
So subway pushing.
The real answer is to read the headline for you. Police seek man who they say violated a corpse on an R train. So, is that really an issue? It's really just, I mean, it's just that's part of life in the big city,
Right.
imagine writing a story about someone sexually penetrating a dead body
In the subway.
in the subway.
It's unreasonable to
Unclear
be
as of
concerned about
yet as
that.
to whether the death was caused by this individual.
Yeah.
And then feeling like the right way to follow that up is, but guys, it's not that bad.
It's not really an issue.
Admittedly, the corpse sexual violations in the subway have remained fairly low over the last couple of years.
Since the 1990s, they're way
It's the
down.
first time
That's
it
right.
happened.
That's right.
Yeah, you really got to look at the overall stats because those things, it's not an everyday thing like some politicians may want you to believe. It's just it's every few weeks, or something.
You gotta.
This still doesn't count toward the assaults on live riders per million rides. So
That's true. And you have to consider the root causes
a
as
living
well.
person. You're right.
Yeah. All right. On that note, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our producer, Isabella Regi. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast, we hope you'll check us out on YouTube or on any platform where you get your podcasts. Please rate, subscribe, leave us comments down below or questions if you want to ask them. We'll probably answer them on the show in future. But I think that's about all the time that we have. So until next time, you've been listening to the City Journal podcast. Hope you'll join us again soon.